Hey guys! Tonight we step into one of the most extraordinary lives in all of human history. A woman born in scandal, raised in danger, who survived plots, prison, and the execution of those closest to her, and still managed to rule one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen for 45 years. Tonight, we're telling the complete life story of Queen Elizabeth I, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the woman who turned vulnerability into invincibility and made her very loneliness into a kind of legend. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. The Wrong Kind of Baby. Let's start at the very beginning, because the very beginning of Elizabeth's life tells you almost everything you need to know about the world she was born into. September 7th, 1533. Greenwich Palace. The Thames glittering outside, the court of England holding its breath. King Henry VIII, 6'2", barrel-chested, terrifyingly powerful, and absolutely convinced he was about to have a son, paces somewhere nearby. He has already done unspeakable things to get to this moment. He split from the Catholic Church, humiliated his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, after over 20 years of marriage, got himself excommunicated by the Pope, and beheaded people who disagreed with him loudly enough. All of this, every last bit of it, was in service of one goal: a legitimate male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. And then the baby arrives. A girl. You can almost hear the silence descend on the court like a cold fog. The elaborate jousting tournament Henry had planned in celebration, quietly cancelled. The announcements of the birth were hastily rewritten, the plural that had been confidently inserted, princes, scratched out. The astrologers who had been certain it would be a boy shuffled their charts with the look of men who hoped no one remembered their predictions. The girl was named Elizabeth, after both her grandmothers. Her mother was Anne Boleyn, sharp, clever, dark-haired, and already walking a tightrope with no net beneath her. Her father was Henry VIII, a man whose love, when it curdled, could become something very close to a death sentence. But here's the thing about Elizabeth that no one appreciated in that moment of royal disappointment. She was born into fire. And fire, as it turns out, is a very good teacher. Within weeks of her birth, Elizabeth was packed off to her own household at Hatfield House, because that is what you did with royal infants. You sent them away from court with their own small retinue of nurses and servants. She had a wet nurse named Mother Jack, a governess, and all the trappings of importance without any of the warmth. Henry visited occasionally, held her up, declared her lively, and left. Anne Boleyn wrote affectionate letters, but was consumed by the constant pressure of court life, by the need to produce a male heir before Henry's eye wandered elsewhere. The early household at Hatfield was Elizabeth's whole world. She grew up among women, nurses, ladies-in-waiting, the quiet officials of a minor royal establishment, in a world that was both privileged and precarious. She had fine clothes and good food and a comfortable house, and she also had the faintly anxious atmosphere of a place that existed at the king's pleasure, that could be shut down or reorganized or dissolved if the winds at court shifted direction. The servants around her were loyal to their small charge, but they were also all aware that her status was not guaranteed. She was the king's daughter when he was feeling generous, and something less specific when he wasn't. She learned to read early. This would have been expected of any royal child, but Elizabeth took to it with a fervour that her tutors noted almost immediately. Books were stable, Books did not change based on the king's mood or the latest rumour from court. The letters on the page meant the same thing on Monday as they did on Friday, and this consistency in a life defined by instability was probably more comforting than anyone could have articulated at the time. She was a physically energetic child, described as bright-eyed and lively, small but vigorous, and the Hatfield household gave her room to run in gardens, to ride, to be a child in ways that the court never quite permitted. These would be among the last years of relative normalcy in Elizabeth Tudor's life, though she couldn't have known that then. Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old when her mother's world began to collapse. Anne Boleyn had miscarried twice. The second miscarriage came in January 1536, and the child, it was said, had appeared to be a boy. Henry's patience, never deep to begin with, evaporated. Within months, Anne was accused of adultery, treason, and a cluster of other charges that historians have debated ever since. Whether any of it was true almost doesn't matter. What matters is that Henry had decided he was done. On the 19th of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed on Tower Green. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. She would never be told clearly, never be properly explained to. She simply had a mother one day, and then she did not. And the word mother became, for a very long time, something she would learn not to speak aloud. Within 11 days of Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. Shortly after, an Act of Parliament declared Elizabeth illegitimate, stripping her of the title of princess and reducing her to plain Lady Elizabeth. She was now behind not just her half-brother, Edward, in the line of succession, but also her half-sister Mary, who had been declared illegitimate and then reinstated in a dizzying series of political reversals. Elizabeth was a toddler navigating the wreckage of her parents' catastrophe, and this was just the beginning. Chapter 2. The Education of a Survivor. Despite the shadow over her birth and the chaos that surrounded her early life, Elizabeth Tudor received an education that was, by any measure, remarkable, and that education would become the bedrock on which everything else she ever built would rest. By the time she was 6, she was studying seriously. By the time she was 10, she was being trained by some of the finest humanist scholars England had to offer. Her principal tutor, William Grindal, and later the great Roger Ascham, taught her in the tradition of Renaissance humanism, which meant not just reading and writing, but thinking, critically, rigorously, beautifully. Elizabeth became fluent in Latin, then in Greek, then in French, Italian, and Spanish. She studied rhetoric, the art of persuasion, the architecture of argument. She read the classical historians, Cicero, Livy, the speeches of Tacitus. She could read a diplomatic letter in 4 languages and compose a response in 3. At a time when most women of any class were considered intellectually ornamental at best, Elizabeth was being trained to think like a statesman. And she took to it. She didn't just learn, she absorbed. She had a memory described by her tutors as almost frightening in its precision. She could quote scripture, translate on the fly, compose speeches that combined classical references with vivid, original imagery. Ascham, who had trained students across Europe, wrote that she had the mind of a man in the body of a woman, which was meant as the highest possible compliment by Renaissance standards, and which Elizabeth herself may have found both gratifying and quietly insulting. Her handwriting was exquisite, the italic hand taught by Ascham, all elegant loops and controlled pressure. She would later be famous for writing in a way that was deliberately beautiful, as if even her penmanship was a performance of controlled power. But it wasn't all books. Elizabeth was also taught music. She played the lute and the virginals with genuine skill, not just polite accomplishment. She loved dancing. She rode horses. She had a physical energy that her tutors occasionally struggled to keep up with, a restlessness that would later manifest in long walks, hunting parties, and a habit of pacing when she thought. She also watched. From the time she was old enough to observe the court, she watched. She watched how her father moved through rooms, how people physically rearranged themselves around him, how the air changed when he entered. She watched which advisors survived and which didn't. She watched what happened to women who expressed too much ambition too, openly. She watched her half-sister Mary, pious and wounded and trusting, navigate a world that kept disappointing her. She watched, and she filed it all away. In 1543, Elizabeth's fortunes shifted when Henry married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. Catherine was educated, Protestant-leaning, and genuinely warm-hearted. Under Catherine's influence, Henry was persuaded to restore both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession in the Third Succession Act of 1544. Elizabeth was back. Not a princess again legally, but restored to the hierarchy that could, under the right circumstances, lead to everything. Catherine also gathered the royal children around her, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, with something approaching real maternal care. For perhaps the first time, Elizabeth lived in a household that felt something like stable. She and Edward exchanged earnest letters about their studies. She was given Latin text to translate. She thrived. Roger Ascham, who taught her, from around 1548, was one of the leading educational reformers of his age. He believed passionately in what he called the double translation method. You read a passage from a classical author in Latin, translated it into English, set it aside, and then translated it back into Latin from your English version, comparing your result to the original. It sounds dry. It was, in practice, a profound exercise in linguistic precision. You couldn't approximate. You couldn't be close. The gap between your Latin and Cicero's Latin was the gap between where you were and where you needed to be. Elizabeth did this for years. It shaped the way she thought. When she gave speeches as queen, and she gave some of the great speeches in the English language, they had the precision of someone who had spent decades learning that every word had to carry exactly the weight you assigned it, not more and not less. Her famous address to Parliament on the question of her marriage, her Tilbury speech, her Golden Speech of 1601, these are not accidental masterpieces. They are the product of an education in language as a discipline, language as power. She was also taught by John Czech, the great Greek scholar, and by other tutors who represented the leading edge of English Renaissance learning. She was not being educated for domesticity. She was being educated, though no one said this aloud, for government. Whether because Catherine Parr recognised something in her, or because the educational philosophy of the time simply defaulted to the highest possible standard for royal pupils regardless of sex, Elizabeth received the kind of training that would have prepared a prince. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it matters. The woman who would eventually face down Parliament, negotiate with foreign ambassadors in their own languages, and write some of the most rhetorically sophisticated speeches of the Tudor age was shaped in large part by a small group of scholars who took her seriously enough to teach her everything they knew. She was also taught by John Czech, the great Greek scholar, and by other tutors who represented the leading edge of English Renaissance learning. She was not being educated for domesticity. She was being educated, though no one said this aloud, for government. Whether because Catherine Parr recognised something in her, or because the educational philosophy of the time simply defaulted to the highest possible standard for royal pupils regardless of sex, Elizabeth received the kind of training that would have prepared a prince. She was 11 years old, and she was, in a way she couldn't yet name, preparing. For what, she wasn't entirely sure. But she was preparing. Chapter 3. Fire and Danger, the Thomas Seymour Affair. In January 1547, Henry VIII died. He was 55 years old, massively overweight, and had spent the last years of his life in increasing physical and mental deterioration, his son Edward, just 9 years old, became King Edward VI, and England entered a new phase, Protestant, reforming, unstable, and run by men jockeying for power around a child king. Catherine Parr, now the Queen Dowager, moved to Chelsea Manor, and Elizabeth, 13 years old, came with her. Then Catherine made a surprising decision. She married Thomas Seymour, quickly, secretly, almost indecently fast after Henry's death. Thomas Seymour was the younger brother of Edward Seymour, who had made himself Lord Protector of England in the King's minority. Thomas was dashing, loud, ambitious, charming in the way that only genuinely dangerous people can be charming. He had wanted to marry either Mary or Elizabeth, had approached the council about it, and had been firmly rebuffed. So he married the Queen Dowager instead, as something of a consolation prize. And then he began to pay attention to Elizabeth. What followed in that Chelsea household is one of the most uncomfortable episodes in Elizabethan history, and historians have spent centuries trying to parse exactly what it was. Seymour began a pattern of behaviour toward Elizabeth: early morning visits to her bedroom, roughhousing, romping that started almost playful and escalated into something that felt far less innocent. Catherine Parr was sometimes present, sometimes laughing along, sometimes holding Elizabeth still, while Thomas cut her gown to pieces in the garden. It reads now as a kind of grooming, and perhaps it was. Elizabeth was 13, 14, Seymour was 36 or 37. Whatever exactly happened, it rattled Elizabeth deeply. She went red in the face at court when his name was mentioned. When the situation became impossible, when Catherine began to notice Elizabeth's distress, or possibly her own husband's intentions, Elizabeth was sent away to live with Sir Anthony Denny and his wife. Catherine Parr died in September 1548 from complications after childbirth, and Thomas Seymour, freed from that constraint, immediately began scheming even more dangerously. He attempted to bribe Edward VI's servants. He cultivated connections with pirates. He hatched a plan to kidnap the young king. He also contacted Elizabeth through intermediaries with the apparent intention of eventually marrying her. It all unravelled. Seymour was arrested in January 1549. His brother, the Lord Protector, signed his death warrant. Thomas Seymour was executed in March 1549, and Elizabeth was interrogated. For weeks, her interrogator, a man named Robert Tyrwhitt, sent by the council, tried to get her to admit that she had been part of Seymour's plans. He used every trick available. He implied her servants had already confessed. He suggested he knew more than he did. He alternated pressure with sympathy. Elizabeth, 15 years old, gave away nothing. She wrote the Lord. Protector herself, directly, calmly, fiercely. She denied the rumours circulating that she was pregnant with Seymour's child. She insisted on her honour. She wrote with a precision and composure that would have been remarkable in a trained diplomat, let alone a teenage girl under suspicion during a political crisis. Tyrwhitt wrote back to his superiors with barely disguised frustration. She had, he said, a very good wit, and nothing is gotten of her, but by great policy. This was not a compliment exactly, but it was a recognition. Elizabeth had been tested under real pressure for the first time, and she had not broken. She had learned something about herself in that interrogation that she would never forget, that she could hold the line, that she could look a dangerous man in the eye and give him nothing, that words were weapons and silence was armour. She was 15 years old, and she already understood power in a way that most people never do. Chapter 4. The long shadow of Mary Edward VI reigned until 1553, when tuberculosis finally overtook him at the age of 15. His death plunged England into one of the most dramatic succession crises in its history. Edward, guided by his chief adviser John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, had tried to prevent both his half-sisters from inheriting, fearing that Mary would reverse the Protestant Reformation, and Elizabeth was, in his view, tainted by her mother's attainder. He named instead Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant great-niece of Henry VIII, and conveniently the daughter-in-law of Northumberland himself. Jane was proclaimed Queen on the 10th of July, 1553. She lasted 9 days. Mary, riding north from Norfolk with a force of supporters that swelled with every mile as the country rallied to her, took the throne without a battle. Northumberland was arrested, Lady Jane Grey and her husband were imprisoned in the Tower, and Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's long-suffering daughter, finally had what she had been waiting for her entire life. Elizabeth had been careful. During the 9 days of Jane's brief reign, she had not declared for either side publicly. She understood instinctively that clarity was dangerous when the situation was still fluid. She waited, watched, and when Mary's victory became obvious, she rode to her half-sister with expressions of loyalty and congratulation. Mary was not a monster. History has been somewhat unkind to her, leaning too heavily on Protestant propaganda written after her death. She was a woman of genuine piety and real intelligence, a woman who had been humiliated and cast aside, and was finally attempting to rebuild what she believed had been wrongfully destroyed. She received Elizabeth with warmth, at least initially. The two women had not exactly been close, but they were family, and Mary seemed inclined to give her Protestant half-sister the benefit of the doubt. Then came the rebellion of January 1554. Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger led a rising in Kent, ostensibly in protest of Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, but with murkier political undertones involving the possible placement of Elizabeth on the throne. The rebellion was crushed, but the damage it did to Elizabeth was severe. Letters were discovered implicating various parties. The question of whether Elizabeth had known about or encouraged the rebellion became suddenly, urgently, terrifyingly relevant. Elizabeth was summoned to court. She came, or tried to come. She was ill, genuinely or diplomatically, and the journey took days. When she arrived in London, she was interrogated by the council. She denied everything. She had known nothing. She had done nothing. Mary's advisers, particularly Lord Chancellor Gardiner, wanted her in the Tower. Wanted her, many suspected, in the Tower, as a prelude to somewhere darker still. Mary herself hesitated. She was not by nature cruel, but she was, surrounded by people telling her that Elizabeth was dangerous, that Elizabeth was a magnet for Protestant rebellion, that Elizabeth alive and free was a permanent threat to her throne. On the 18th of February, 1554, Elizabeth was taken to the Tower of London. She went in through Traitor's Gate, the same water entrance her mother had used 18 years before, the same entrance through which so many had passed and never returned. She sat down on the wet steps and refused to move for a moment. When urged to come in out of the rain, she is said to have replied with that very Elizabethan combination of self-pity and defiance, "Better sitting here than in a worse place." She spent 2 months in the Tower, 2 months of not knowing whether each day would be her last, of watching the interrogations circle closer, of composing herself in the cold grey rooms and waiting. The investigation turned up no solid evidence against her. She had been too careful, too consistent, too relentlessly opaque. She spent 2 months in the Tower, 2 months of not knowing whether each day would be her last, of watching the interrogations circle closer, of composing herself in the cold grey rooms and waiting. The investigation turned up no solid evidence against her. She had been too careful, too consistent, too relentlessly opaque. The Tower of London in 1554 was not a place you went and came back from, as a rule. It was an end point. It was where careers concluded and heads left shoulders. Elizabeth had grown up knowing this. She had grown up knowing what the Tower meant, because her mother had gone to the Tower and had not come back. She walked through those gates, and she would have known, in whatever way a 20-year-old knows things about her own mortality, that this might be it. And she held herself together. The accounts we have of her time in the Tower suggest a woman who understood that her composure itself was a political act. To weep, to beg, to collapse into visible. Terror would have given her enemies something to use. It would have confirmed the narrative of guilt. She refused to give them anything. She maintained her innocence. She maintained her dignity. She wrote letters that were controlled and clear. She waited. There is something almost incomprehensible about the quality of self-possession required to do that. She was 20 years old. Her mother had been executed in this place. People were being interrogated around her. People who might say things that would condemn her. The regime that had imprisoned her was actively looking for reasons to destroy her. And she held the line. She was released to house arrest at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, where she spent nearly a year under the watchful eye of Sir Henry Bedingfield. She was allowed a small household. She was not allowed to communicate freely. She scratched a poem on a window with a diamond ring. Much suspected of me, nothing proved can be. It is a line worth sitting with. A line of absolute controlled defiance from a woman who had just survived the Tower, who was still technically a prisoner, who had every reason to despair, and who instead picked up a diamond and wrote herself a declaration. She was 20 years old. What she emerged from Woodstock understanding, or rather, what she had confirmed and deepened, was that the only safe version of herself was an unknowable one. The interrogations had failed because she had given them nothing to work with. Her survival had depended on the opacity she had spent years cultivating. She would carry that lesson into her reign and never entirely set it down. Even at the height of her power, even with England at her feet, there would always be something held back, something not quite sayable, some core of Elizabeth that she kept entirely to herself. Chapter 5. The Miraculous Accession. Mary I reigned for 5 years. They were, by many measures, miserable years for Protestant England. The heresy laws were revived. Approximately 300 Protestants were burned at the stake, which is how Mary got the nickname Bloody Mary, though the number was not, historically speaking, exceptional by European standards of religious persecution. Still, the burnings were public, visible, and seared into the collective memory of a nation that was, in its majority, moving toward Protestantism. Mary also failed to produce an heir. She believed herself pregnant twice. Both pregnancies turned out to be false, possibly the result of uterine cancer or another serious illness. Her husband Philip of Spain spent as little time in England as possible. She was lonely, isolated, and increasingly unwell. Elizabeth waited at Hatfield. She rode, she read, she played her lute. She corresponded carefully, each letter a performance of loyalty and religious ambiguity. She went to Mass when required, Protestant ceremony when possible, and gave nothing away about her innermost convictions to anyone who might carry the information back to court. She was learning, in those years of enforced waiting, how to govern herself, which is perhaps the most important lesson a ruler can ever learn. On the 17th of November, 1558, Mary I died. She was 42 years old. The news was brought to Elizabeth at Hatfield, where she was sitting under an oak tree in the park. According to the accounts that have come down to us, she received the news, and with it the knowledge that she was now Queen of England, and said, in Latin, "This is the doing of the Lord, and it is marvellous in our eyes." She was 25 years old. She had survived illegitimacy, the execution of her mother, The chaos of 3 reigns, interrogation, imprisonment, and a decade of living under the constant possibility of violent death. She had survived it all through intelligence, discipline, and a quality that would define her entire reign. The ability to hold multiple, contradictory things in her mind at once without resolving them, and to use that irresolution as a kind of power. She rode to London. The city went wild. Whatever England had felt about Mary's reign, and there had been those who mourned her genuinely, the sight of young Elizabeth Tudor, red-haired and sharp-eyed, riding through crowds of cheering citizens, was electric. England was ready for her. England needed her. She was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 15th of January, 1559. The crown placed on her head was heavy. Everything about it was heavy. She was inheriting a kingdom deeply in debt, religiously divided, diplomatically weakened, and still theoretically at war with France. She had no husband, no guaranteed heir, and advisers who, however loyal, were all men who would need to be managed carefully. She was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 15th of January, 1559. The crown placed on her head was heavy. Everything about it was heavy. She was inheriting a kingdom deeply in debt, religiously divided, diplomatically weakened, and still theoretically at war with France. She had no husband, no guaranteed heir, and advisers who, however loyal, were all men who would need to be managed carefully. The coronation itself was a masterpiece of managed symbolism. Elizabeth had worked with her astrologer John Dee to select an auspicious date. The procession through London the day before, a dazzling pageant of floats, speeches, allegorical performances, was designed to introduce this new queen to her capital in the most favourable possible light. And Elizabeth played her part with the instinctive brilliance of someone who had been watching royal performance her entire life. She paused to listen to the pageants, even when no protocol required it. She spoke to people in the crowds. She accepted a gift of rosemary from an old woman and kept it visibly in her hand for the rest of the procession. She wept at a tableau representing the Protestant faith openly and apparently genuinely. Whether the tears were real or calculated or some inextricable mixture of the two, they worked. The crowd loved her. London had been unenthusiastic about Mary's reign, had endured the spectacle of heresy burnings and a Spanish king who treated England as a useful province. The sight of this young, English, Protestant, visibly emotional queen moving through their city produced an eruption of joy that contemporary accounts describe as almost overwhelming. But the joy of a coronation day does not govern a kingdom. The morning after, the work began, and the first decision she made tell you more about Elizabeth than any speech ever could. She chose William Cecil as her principal secretary. Cecil was 38 years old, deeply Protestant, immensely able and completely dedicated to the service of the English state. He would serve her for 40 years. She told him, on appointing him, that she required of him only this: to give her his opinion plainly, without fear, without flattery. He did. Not always comfortably, not always without friction. There were enormous arguments between them over the course of their 4 decades together. But he gave her what she asked for, and she valued it above almost anything else she received from anyone. She walked out of Westminster Abbey that January day as Queen Elizabeth I of England, and she began. Chapter 6. The Virgin Queen and the Question of Marriage. The question that would define the first 2 decades of Elizabeth's reign, that would obsess her council, her parliament, foreign courts, and historians ever since, was simple in its framing and impossible in its answer. Who would she marry? To the men around her, the question was obvious in its urgency. A queen needed a husband. A kingdom needed an heir. Without a direct successor, England would plunge into another succession crisis the moment Elizabeth died, which could happen at any time: disease, childbirth, assassination. The logic was straightforward. Elizabeth understood the logic perfectly. She also understood something her advisors consistently failed to grasp: that marriage for a queen regnant was not the same calculation as marriage for a king. If she married a foreign prince, and there were candidates from Spain, France, Austria, Sweden, she risked subordinating England's interests to another crown. Her half-sister's marriage to Philip of Spain had been deeply unpopular, and it had made Mary appear to be a dependent of a foreign power rather than a sovereign in her own right. Elizabeth had watched that. She remembered. If she married an English nobleman, she created a different problem. She elevated one faction of the nobility above all others, generating resentment and political instability. She would be choosing sides in a game that functioned only while she remained above it. And there was something else, something that Elizabeth may not have been able to articulate fully even to herself, something rooted in what she had observed her entire life about the fate of women who gave their power to men. Her mother had been executed. Her stepmother, Catherine Parr, had nearly been arrested. Her half-sister Mary had been manipulated and misled by a husband, who barely seemed to notice when she was dying. Elizabeth had spent 25 years in a world where women's power was always conditional, always mediated through men, always able to be taken away. She had clawed her way to the top of that world through exceptional personal discipline, and now she was being asked to hand the keys to someone else. So she didn't. Not exactly. Instead, she did something unprecedented and maddening, and, in retrospect, brilliant. She kept everyone in a state of permanent matrimonial suspense. She entertained suitors, she flirted, she negotiated. She allowed marriage discussions to proceed for months, sometimes years, without ever reaching a conclusion. She kept the Holy Roman Emperor's son, Archduke Charles, interested for nearly a decade. She conducted an on-again, off-again negotiation with the Duke of Anjou, the French prince, that lasted well into her 40s. She implied, she suggested. She allowed hope without ever confirming it. Anjou, Francis, Duke of Alençon, came closest of any foreign candidate to actually marrying her. He visited England twice, in 1579 and 1581. She called him her frog. He was notably small and reportedly not conventionally attractive, and seemed to feel genuine warmth toward him, or at least to enjoy the performance of warmth. When he left England for the last time in 1582, she reportedly wept and wrote him poetry, but she didn't follow him to the altar. When her council expressed almost unanimous opposition to the match, she gave way, but she made sure they knew she was giving way, that the sacrifice was hers, that England owed her for the happiness she was surrendering. It was, among many things, a masterclass in political accountability shifting. This drove her council to distraction. They begged, pleaded, demanded that she name a successor at minimum if she would not marry. She refused. Naming a successor, she explained, would be like setting up a second court, a rival power centre around which all discontented elements would gather. It would be, as she memorably told Parliament, to require her to think of her own winding sheet while she was still in good health. The marriage question was inseparable from the one great personal passion of Elizabeth's life, Robert Dudley. Dudley had been Elizabeth's childhood friend, the son of the Duke of Northumberland. When Elizabeth became queen, she made him master of the horse, a position that kept him constantly close, and she showered him with attention and favour that was, in its warmth and its consistency, unmistakably personal. They rode together, they danced together. Court gossip crackled with speculation. Foreign ambassadors reported home that the Queen and her master of the horse were very close indeed, that they spoke privately for hours, that she seemed a different person in his company. less controlled, more alive. In September 1560, Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase. It was ruled accidental, but the rumours were immediate and brutal. Had Dudley arranged it? Had Elizabeth encouraged him? The scandal was so damaging that Elizabeth pulled back from any public move toward marriage with him, even though many historians believe she genuinely loved him in whatever way she allowed herself to love anything. It is worth noting that the investigation at the time found no evidence of foul play, and modern historians have suggested various medical explanations, including spinal cancer, for Amy's death. But in politics, the appearance matters as much as the reality, and the appearance was catastrophic. Elizabeth could not marry a man who the world believed had arranged his wife's death to make himself available. It would have destroyed her reputation in every European court, given her enemies precisely the ammunition they needed, and undermined the image of moral authority that was one of her most important political assets. She made him Earl of Leicester. She kept him close for the rest of his life. She wept when he died in 1588. But she never married him. The Virgin Queen was not a pure ideological position, not simply a piece of propaganda. It was a solution, however strange, however lonely, to an equation that had no clean answer. By remaining unmarried, Elizabeth remained sole sovereign. She remained above faction. She remained, in a way that was uniquely possible for a woman in her position, free. She knew the price of it. There are moments in her letters, her speeches, even her recorded conversations, where you can see the loneliness of the calculation she had made. But she made it, and she kept making it, every year for 45 years. Chapter 7. Religion and the Elizabethan Settlement. One of the first and most consequential things Elizabeth had to do as Queen was decide what England believed, and she had to do it in a way that didn't tear the country apart. Henry VIII had broken from Rome. Edward VI had pushed England sharply Protestant. Mary had dragged it back to Catholicism. The country was, by 1558, religiously exhausted and deeply divided. There were zealous Protestants who wanted a thorough continental-style Reformation. There were Catholics who had never accepted the break with Rome. There were the vast majority of ordinary English people somewhere in the middle, wanting to worship without being burned for it, wanting clarity without extremism. Elizabeth herself is one of the most religiously ambiguous figures in English history. She used Protestant rhetoric. She appointed Protestant bishops. She believed in clerical celibacy and kept crucifixes in her private chapel long after hardline Protestants had removed them from churches. She hated Calvinist predestination, disliked long sermons, and was once observed walking out on one she found too extended. She was, by personal disposition, something like a moderate Catholic who had made her theological peace with Protestantism, pragmatic as in nearly everything. The Elizabethan settlement of 1559 was the legislation that established this pragmatism as national policy. The Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity reinstated the monarch as head of the Church of England and established a revised Protestant prayer book as the official form of worship, but deliberately kept its language ambiguous enough that it could be interpreted by Catholics and Protestants in ways compatible with their own beliefs. The communion service, for instance, was written so that it could be read either as a real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which Catholics believed, or as a symbolic commemoration, which Reformers preferred. Priests wore vestments that the Reformers hated, but that preserved the ceremonial dignity that traditionalists expected. The result was a church that satisfied nobody completely and offended nobody fatally, which was precisely the point. The settlement held, not perfectly, not without challenges, but it held for the duration of her reign and beyond. Elizabeth enforced it consistently, resisting pressure from both flanks, from Puritans who wanted to strip the church further, and from Catholics who hoped to reverse it. She was not by inclination a persecutor. She famously said she did not wish to make windows into men's souls. You could believe what you liked in private. You needed to conform publicly. The difference, she understood, was everything. The Northern Rebellion of 1569 was the first major domestic challenge to the settlement. The Catholic Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland raised a force in the north of England, marched under the banner of the 5 Wounds of Christ, and celebrated the Mass in Durham Cathedral. Their goal was vague: to place Mary Queen of Scots on the English throne, to restore the old religion. But their ambition was real enough to terrify the council. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, partly by the slow advance of government forces and partly by the fundamental lack of the popular support the earls had expected. The North was conservative and Catholic, but not willing to die for it on this particular occasion. Elizabeth's response to the rebellion was, by the standards of Tudor repression, controlled. Several hundred people were executed, the standard punishment for treason, and not especially lenient by the norms of the time. But there was no wholesale slaughter, no attempt to stamp out Northern Catholic culture through systematic terror. She was sending a message, not starting a war. That said, the settlement was increasingly under pressure as her reign advanced. The Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570, which technically released English Catholics from their loyalty to her and made Catholicism, in the state's view, increasingly synonymous with treason. Missionary priests began entering England secretly from the continent, trained at seminaries in France and Spain, ministering to recusant Catholics in secret rooms and hidden chapels. The state hunted them, and when caught, they were not simply imprisoned. They were executed for treason. It was always carefully specified, not for religion. The most famous of these missionaries was Edmund Campion, a brilliant Jesuit scholar who had been a celebrated figure at Oxford before his conversion and ordination abroad. He returned to England in 1580 and spent a year moving secretly between Catholic households, saying Mass, hearing confessions, writing a challenging theological manifesto. He was caught in 1581, brought to the Tower, interrogated with considerable harshness, tried, and executed. His death made him a martyr in Catholic memory and a political problem for Elizabeth, who had explicitly insisted that it was his treasonous activities, not his religion, that had condemned him. The distinction was, in practice, very difficult to maintain. Saying Mass was illegal. Harbouring a priest was illegal. The practice of Catholicism under Elizabeth was not in theory a capital offence, but the conditions under which it had to be practised made it permanently adjacent to treason, and the line between religious practice and political allegiance was impossible to draw cleanly in a world where the Pope had declared the Queen a heretic to be deposed. And there were those among Elizabeth's advisers, her principal secretary William Cecil, and later his son Robert, who believed that the Catholic threat was existential and needed to be met with force. Elizabeth characteristically moved slower and less decisively than her council wished. She didn't like bloodshed. She disliked the martyr-making that excessive persecution created. She understood that if you killed enough people for their beliefs, you didn't extinguish those beliefs. You just made them glow brighter in the dark. Chapter 8. Mary Queen of Scots, the problem that would not go away. If the marriage question was the chronic headache of Elizabeth's reign, Mary Queen of Scots was the migraine. Mary Stuart was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister, Margaret, which made her, by Catholic reckoning, not just a potential claimant to the English throne, but the rightful queen, since Catholics did not recognise Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, which meant they did not recognise Elizabeth's legitimacy at all. Mary was also Queen of Scotland, had been Queen of France. Her first husband, Francis II, had died young, was young, beautiful by contemporary accounts, Catholic, charming, and a genuine political force. The two queens never met. This is one of the great tantalizing absences of the period. They corresponded, sometimes with what seems like genuine warmth, sometimes with elaborate diplomatic coolness. They sent each other gifts. They each reportedly asked careful questions about the other's appearance to those who had seen both of them, as if trying to form an impression of a woman whose existence was both a personal and political problem. Elizabeth knew that every Catholic plot against her used Mary as its focus. Mary knew that her freedom depended entirely on Elizabeth's goodwill, and that Elizabeth's goodwill was not unconditional. She was also, as history would reveal, spectacularly bad at making decisions. Mary returned to Scotland in 1561 after her husband's death, and proceeded, over the following years, to make a sequence of choices that alienated her nobility, her people, and ultimately any foreign ally who might have helped her. She married her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in 1565, handsome, vain, and dissolute. Darnley helped organise the murder of Mary's Italian secretary, David Rizzio, in front of her, while she was pregnant. In 1567, Darnley himself died when the house he was staying in exploded, and he was found dead in the garden. Then, impossibly, Mary married the Earl of Bothwell, widely suspected of having arranged Darnley's death, just 3 months later. Scotland rebelled. Mary was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son James, and escaped in 1568, whereupon she crossed the border into England and threw herself on Elizabeth's mercy. Elizabeth was in an impossible position. Mary was a queen, an anointed monarch. Elizabeth's instincts, her genuine beliefs about the sanctity of monarchy, made her deeply reluctant to treat a fellow queen as a criminal. But Mary in England was a lit match in a room full of gunpowder. Every Catholic dissident in England, every foreign power that wanted Elizabeth destabilised, would immediately see Mary as a potential rallying point, a legitimate alternative queen waiting in the wings. Elizabeth's solution was characteristically ambiguous. She put Mary under something that was called protective custody, and was in practice comfortable house arrest, moved from one country manor to another over 19 years, attended by her own servants, permitted to correspond, never brought to trial, and never freed. Over those 19 years, Mary remained the focal point of Catholic conspiracy against Elizabeth. The Ridolfi plot of 1571, the Throckmorton plot of 1583, the Babington plot of 1586, each one aimed in various ways at replacing Elizabeth with Mary. Each one was eventually detected by Elizabeth's intelligence services, run with ruthless efficiency by Sir Francis Walsingham, who had built a network of spies across Europe that was the most sophisticated of its age. Walsingham himself is a fascinating figure, Elizabeth's spy master, her dark engine. He was a deeply committed Protestant who believed, with genuine conviction, that the survival of Protestant England was the most important cause in the world, and that absolutely any measure was justified in defending it. He ran agents in every major European court. He intercepted mail. He cultivated informants inside Catholic networks. He was, by modern standards, operating something very like a systematic state intelligence service, built from personal conviction and funded erratically and inadequately, but effective. He despised Mary Queen of Scots. He believed, with evidence that accumulated for years, that she was a danger that would eventually consume Elizabeth if not removed. The Babington plot was, in a sense, the moment Walsingham had been waiting for. The Babington plot was the one that finally broke the stalemate. Walsingham not only detected it, but allowed it to develop, gathering enough evidence to implicate Mary directly. Letters to and from Mary were intercepted and decoded. She had apparently agreed to the plan, which included the assassination of Elizabeth. The trial and conviction of Mary Queen of Scots followed. Elizabeth signed the death warrant and then didn't sign it and then signed it again. She delayed and anguished and postponed in a way that drove her council to near despair. Whatever she thought of Mary personally, executing an anointed queen was crossing a threshold she found deeply, viscerally uncomfortable. Not because she lacked the will, she had signed plenty of death warrants, but because it felt like a kind of self-betrayal, a blow against the principle of royal inviolability that protected her own crown too. In the end, her secretary William Davison sent the warrant without waiting for a final explicit confirmation. Elizabeth, furious, had him imprisoned, but Mary was dead. On the 8th of February, 1587, Mary Queen of Scots was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. She wore red, the Catholic colour of martyrdom, and died, by multiple accounts, with composure and dignity. Elizabeth went into something very close to breakdown when the news reached her. Whether the grief was real or performed, and it may have been both, she was inconsolable for days. She had not wanted this. She had wanted the problem to simply resolve itself without requiring her to be the agent of resolution. But she had been, and the ripples spread outward immediately. Chapter 9. The Spanish Armada, England's finest hour. Philip of Spain had been watching England with increasing fury for years. The Protestant heretics, raiding his ships, Sir Francis Drake, who Elizabeth called her dear pirate, circumnavigating the globe and plundering Spanish treasure on the way. English volunteers fighting against Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and now the execution of Mary, the Catholic claimant, the martyred queen, was the final calculation completed. Philip began assembling the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. 130 ships, around 18,000 soldiers, 24,000 sailors and support staff. The plan was to sail up the English Channel, join forces with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, cross to England, overthrow Elizabeth, and restore the country to the true Catholic faith. It was, by its ambition, breathtaking. It was, Philip believed, the will of God. It arrived in English waters in late July 1588. England's response was improvised, bold and brilliant. Lord Howard of Effingham commanded the English fleet, with Drake as his vice-admiral. The English ships were faster, more manoeuvrable, lower in the water. They harassed the Armada up the Channel, picking at it rather than engaging it directly, disrupting its formation, preventing the rendezvous with Parma's forces from happening cleanly. The Armada moved in a tight crescent formation. The Spanish tactical doctrine was to close with the enemy and board, bringing their superior soldiers to bear. The English understood this and refused to let it happen. They stayed at distance, exchanging cannon fire, trying to break the formation without success for days. The Spanish gunnery was less effective than their English counterparts, partly because their cannon were designed for close-range bombardment rather than long-range accuracy, and partly because the conditions in the Channel made precise gunnery almost impossible. But the English couldn't break the crescent either. For days the two fleets moved up the Channel in a running engagement that was tactically inconclusive, watching each other, probing, neither able to deliver a decisive blow. The tension was extraordinary. England was watching its coastline from cliff tops. Beacon fires were ready on every headland to signal an invasion. The English army at Tilbury was assembling, preparing to fight on land if the sea battle failed. Then came the fireship attack off Gravelines on the night of the 7th of August. 8 English ships were filled with combustible materials, set alight, and sent sailing into the tightly packed Armada. The Spanish ships cut their anchor cables in panic and scattered. In the chaos, the English fleet attacked. The engagement at Gravelines was brutal and decisive. Spanish ships were damaged, driven north, and then the weather intervened, the great storms that sent the Armada spiralling around the Scottish and Irish coasts, where ship after ship wrecked on rocks or sank. Of the original 130 ships, perhaps 67 made it back to Spain. Rest were lost. The survivors who made it to the Irish coast were in desperate condition, starving, shipwrecked, injured. Many were cut down on the beaches by local landowners who feared association with the Spanish. The great fleet that had been supposed to deliver England back to Rome lay rotting on the rocks of the Atlantic fringe. Philip of Spain, when he heard the news, said simply, "I sent my fleet against men, not against the storms and waves of God." He remained King of Spain for another 10 years and continued to plot against England. He was resilient in the way that only very powerful people who never personally experience the consequences of their decisions can afford to be. But before anyone was certain the crisis had passed, before anyone knew how the sea battle had gone, Elizabeth did something that cemented her legend. She went to Tilbury. On the 9th of August, 1588, Elizabeth rode to the camp at Tilbury where her land forces were assembled, waiting for the invasion they believed was still coming. She wore a silver breastplate over a white velvet dress and rode a grey horse, and she gave the speech, "You may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." The crowd roared. The men who had been waiting to die for her roared. Elizabeth Tudor, 55 years old, riding among her soldiers, in the shadow of what she believed might be the end of everything she had built, roared back at them with her whole self. The speech is worth reading in its entirety if you haven't. It's short, only a few hundred words, but it has the compression of a diamond. Every line carries. She acknowledges her physical vulnerability and then dismisses it as irrelevant. She claims masculine authority, the heart and stomach of a king, while standing before them visibly as a woman in a white dress. She tells her soldiers she is willing to die alongside them. She calls them her people, not her subjects. She turns the potential catastrophe of their situation, a foreign invasion, the possibility of defeat and death, into a shared purpose that she presents as a kind of honour. The Armada crisis was the defining moment of her reign, not because England won, though England winning mattered enormously, but because of what Elizabeth revealed about herself in that moment. The woman who had spent decades being cautious and ambiguous and strategically opaque stood at Tilbury and was completely, unmistakably herself, defiant, fearless, and absolutely certain that she and her kingdom were one single thing. Bonfires were lit across England. Church bells rang. There were sermons preaching divine deliverance. And Elizabeth's reign entered a golden age of sorts, or at least a mythological one. It was the age that would be romanticized, written about, celebrated. The Elizabethan age of Shakespeare and Marlowe, of Drake and Raleigh, of exploration and discovery, and English confidence striding out onto a wider world. Chapter 10. The Elizabethan Court: Power, Performance and Personality. To understand Elizabeth, you have to understand her court, because her court was not just the centre of government. It was, in a very deliberate sense, a theatre, and Elizabeth was always the lead performer. The court moved with Elizabeth between her various royal palaces: Whitehall, Greenwich, Hampton Court, Richmond, Windsor. It was an enormous, expensive, perpetually mobile machine, housing hundreds of people, consuming vast quantities of food and fuel, and creating the constant political activity that was the lifeblood of the Elizabethan state. Getting access to the Queen was everything. Without access, you had no influence. Without influence, you had nothing. Elizabeth understood this and managed it with tremendous precision. She controlled access to herself. She decided who saw her and when, who was invited to dance with, her who was admitted to her privy chamber, who received a special private word. These were not just social niceties. They were instruments of power. To be favoured was to be elevated. To fall out of favour was to feel it immediately, in the coolness of her greetings, in the reduced access, in the way conversation stopped when you entered rooms. The annual progresses were one of her most powerful political tools. Each summer, Elizabeth and her court would travel through the country, staying at the houses of nobles and gentry along the route, hunting, processing through towns, being seen. For the people of England beyond London, these progresses were often the only chance they would ever have to actually see their queen in person, and she performed for them magnificently. She stopped for petitioners, she leaned out of her litter to accept flowers from children. She made speeches of extraordinary warmth to the people who turned out to see her in market towns and village greens. She understood, intuitively and completely, that the relationship between a monarch and the governed was not merely administrative. It was emotional. It required to be renewed, physically, regularly, in person. The hosts of her progresses, meanwhile, were often financially ruined by the experience. Entertaining Elizabeth and her court of hundreds, feeding them, housing them, providing entertainments, theatrical performances, hunting, elaborate masks, for days or even weeks could consume years of income. The hospitality was compulsory. If you were honoured by a royal visit, you paid for that honour, sometimes devastatingly. Leicester spent a colossal sum hosting Elizabeth at Kenilworth Castle in 1575 for 19 days of celebrations that have gone down in history as one of the most spectacular entertainments of the Tudor age. Fireworks, jousting, elaborate water pageants, a floating island with singers dressed as the ancient gods. It was theatrical genius and financial catastrophe in equal measure. She cultivated a cult of personality that was carefully constructed and genuinely felt at the same time. The imagery surrounding her was extraordinary. The portraits, the poems, the masks and entertainments. She was Gloriana, the fairy queen, Diana the virgin huntress, Astrea, the just goddess of antiquity returned to earth in the last great age. The poets wrote about her. The painters depicted her. Edmund Spenser dedicated his great poem The Fairy Queen to her directly. Sir Walter Raleigh named an entire colony Virginia in honour of her virginity. None of this was accidental. Elizabeth's cultural programme was as deliberate and sophisticated as her foreign policy. The imagery of the Virgin Queen was a political argument. She was married to England. Her people were her children. She needed no husband because she was wed to the nation itself. It was brilliant, and it was lonely, and it probably worked better as propaganda than it ever did as personal consolation. The portraits deserve special attention because Elizabeth controlled them more directly than any previous English monarch. As she aged, she progressively tightened her grip on how she was depicted. A pattern portrait, an official approved likeness, was produced and copies sent out to artists across England. Painters who deviated too far from the approved image could face serious trouble. The result is a series of late portraits in which Elizabeth barely ages at all. The face is a mask of white paint, the features stylized almost to abstraction. In the Ditchley portrait, she stands on a map of England, literally above it, literally containing it within her image. In the Armada portrait, the Spanish fleet burns in the window behind her, while she rests her hand on a globe. Her personal style was flamboyant. Her wardrobe at her death reportedly contained over 2,000 gowns. She wore elaborate ruffs, jewels of extraordinary variety, wigs of red gold hair as she aged, and her own hair thinned. The portraits of her in later life, the famous Armada portrait, the Rainbow Portrait, show a woman who had transcended aging by the sheer force of iconography. The face is stylized almost beyond recognition. The costume is overwhelming. She is not showing you a person, she is showing you a symbol. And yet, Those who were closest to her saw through the symbol to the person, and their accounts suggest someone remarkably vivid, quick-tempered, funny, deeply competitive, thin-skinned about certain things and armoured against others, passionately interested in music and dancing and languages, capable of great generosity and devastating coldness within the same conversation. She swore, fluidly and creatively. She threw things occasionally. She kept her counsellors in a constant state of managed anxiety, never entirely certain where they stood. She was also, under the performance, genuinely lonely. The women of her privy chamber were her closest companions, but they were also her servants, and the relationship had clear limits. Her great friends, Cat Ashley, who had been her governess from childhood, the woman who had helped her through the Seymour nightmare and the Tower and Woodstock, died in 1565, and Elizabeth mourned her extravagantly. Robert Dudley died in September 1588, just weeks after Tilbury, and she locked herself in her room for days before the council had her door broken open. The price of power, as she always understood, was a particular kind of isolation. She had known this before she even took the throne. She had arranged herself for it, but knowing something and living it are different things entirely, and there are moments in her story where the distance between the icon and the woman feels very close to breaking. Chapter 11. The Later Years, Struggles and the Essex Crisis. The 1590s were not the golden years. They were the difficult ones, the ones that don't make it into the mythology quite so easily, but that tell you, perhaps, more about what Elizabeth truly was. Spain had not given up after 1588. There were further armadas in 1596 and 1597, both broken up by storms before they could reach England. The war with Spain continued, expensive and draining, for the rest of Elizabeth's reign. England was also deeply involved in the long struggle in Ireland, where a series of rebellions culminated in the 9 Years' War, a conflict that consumed enormous resources and came closer than almost any other event to genuinely humiliating the crown. Her council was changing too. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, the man who had served her since the first days of her reign, who had been the backbone of her government for 40 years, was aging and increasingly frail. He died in August 1598. Elizabeth, by his own son's account, visited him frequently as he lay dying, feeding him broth herself. When he was gone, she lost what was perhaps the one person in her entire reign who had combined absolute loyalty with the willingness to tell her things she didn't want to hear, and whom she trusted enough to actually listen to. His son, Robert Cecil, inherited his political role, but not his relationship with the Queen, and into the vacuum left by Burghley's declining authority stepped Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Essex was dangerous from the beginning. He was the stepson of Robert Dudley, which gave him a special access to Elizabeth's affection that he leveraged without restraint. He was young, reckless, brilliant in battle, and constitutionally incapable of accepting that Elizabeth's favour was conditional. He treated her attention as an entitlement. He argued with her in public. He turned his back on her, literally during one confrontation, in a gesture of such disrespect that Elizabeth struck him and he reached for his sword. A man who reached for his sword in the presence of the Queen for any reason not involving her personal defence was not a man whose grip on reality could be entirely trusted. She forgave him, repeatedly. She sent him to Ireland in 1599 to deal with the rebellion of the Earl of Tyrone, giving him the largest English army that had been assembled in years and instructions that were clear. Defeat Tyrone. Secure Ireland. He did neither. Instead, he negotiated an unauthorized truce with Tyrone, essentially recognizing the rebels' demands, and then abandoned his command entirely, riding back to England without permission and appearing before Elizabeth in her bedchamber early one morning before she was dressed or wigged, having ridden through the night. He saw her as she actually was, not as the icon. Whether this was calculated or simply impulsive is unclear. It was certainly fatal. She received him calmly. Then, once she had composed herself, she destroyed him. He was stripped of his offices, placed under house arrest, and investigated by the Privy Council. He was financially ruined when Elizabeth refused to renew his monopoly on sweet wines, which had been the source of most of his income. The Essex house, which he had stocked with followers and hangers-on, became a seething, resentful enclave of men who had everything to lose. On the 8th of February, 1601, Essex led a ragged group of about 200 supporters through the streets of London, apparently hoping to raise the city against the Queen's government. London did not rise. His followers melted away. He retreated to Essex House and eventually surrendered. He was tried for treason. He confessed, apparently with something like relief. He named names. He was executed on the 25th of February, 1601. Elizabeth signed that warrant without the visible anguish she had shown over Mary Queen of Scots. Whatever she had felt for Essex, and it had been real, whatever it was, it did not prevent her from doing what power required. But those who were with her afterward reported that she sat alone for long periods, staring at nothing, and that she played on her lute until her fingers bled. Chapter 12. The Golden Age. Shakespeare, Drake, and the world England was making. It is impossible to tell the story of Elizabeth's reign without stepping back at some point and simply looking at what was being built around her, sometimes because of her, and sometimes in spite of her limitations. The Elizabethan age produced, in the space of roughly 50 years, a flowering of English culture and enterprise that remains almost incomprehensibly rich. It begins to feel almost supernatural, the sheer concentration of extraordinary minds in one period, until you remember that Elizabeth's England was a society that genuinely valued wit and learning, that the court rewarded eloquence and intelligence, and that the competitive environment of the Elizabethan theatre, patronage system, and intellectual culture created conditions in which talent could be discovered, tested, and made famous. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, Philip Sidney, Francis Bacon. These are not minor figures. These are people who reshaped the English language, who invented new ways of thinking about human experience, who are still being read, studied, performed, and argued about 500 years later. Shakespeare wrote Hamlet and King Lear, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, and 34 other plays, mostly in the space of 20 years, in a city and a reign that had made the public theatre a cultural institution in a way England had never seen before. The theatre itself, the playhouses of Suffolk, the Globe, the Rose, deserves its own pause. Before Elizabeth's reign, drama in England was largely religious and occasional. Mystery plays performed in churches or market squares, morality plays with simple allegorical characters. The Tudor period transformed this into something new: professional, secular, commercial theatre, permanent playhouses, built for the purpose, professional acting companies with royal patronage, audiences drawn from every social class, the groundlings standing in the pit paying a penny, the wealthy sitting in covered galleries, all watching together. The theatre was one of the few spaces in Tudor England that cut across social boundaries, that made a cobbler and a courtier share an experience simultaneously. And the plays that were written for these spaces, the plays of Marlowe, of Shakespeare, of Ben Jonson, were extraordinary in their ambition. They dealt with kings and commoners, with love and politics and philosophy, with the nature of power and the limits of loyalty. They dealt, obliquely and sometimes very directly, with the world their audiences actually lived in. Marlowe's Dr. Faustus explored the dangers of overreaching ambition in a culture electrified by ambition. Shakespeare's history plays negotiated questions of legitimate authority that were directly relevant to a country whose queen had spent her life arguing about the nature of legitimate authority. Elizabeth went to plays. She patronised theatrical companies. The Globe Theatre, the Rose Theatre, the stages of Southwark, they existed in a climate of royal approval, even if Elizabeth herself was occasionally uncomfortable with plays that touched too closely on political themes. When a production of Richard II, which depicted the deposition of a king, was performed suspiciously close to the Essex Rebellion, Elizabeth famously observed that this history play had been performed 40 times in the streets, and then asked pointedly, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" She knew what culture did. She understood that stories about power could shape what people believed about it. She kept a watchful eye on the stages, as she kept a watchful eye on everything. At sea, England was remaking itself as a maritime power in ways that would echo through the following centuries. Francis Drake had circumnavigated the globe in 1577 to 1580, and Elizabeth had knighted him on the deck of his ship. John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, Humphrey Gilbert, Walter Raleigh, English ships were probing further and further out into the Atlantic, down the coast of Africa, west toward the Americas. The Roanoke colony had been established in Virginia, and though it had mysteriously vanished, the idea of English settlement in the New World had taken root. Drake himself was one of the defining personalities of the age, a Devon man of modest origin who sailed around the entire world and came home with treasure that helped finance the Queen's treasury and his own fame in equal measure. Elizabeth officially denied that she had authorized his raiding of Spanish ships. Privately, she called him her dear pirate and took the largest share of his plunder. It was a relationship that captured something essential about the Elizabethan spirit. Bold, a little dishonest, tremendously effective, and always wrapped in the language of national honour. The East India Company was chartered by Elizabeth in 1600, the last year of her reign, and this modest trading company, established with a royal charter and the capital of a few London merchants, would, over the next 2.5 centuries, become the vehicle through which England built the largest empire in human history. Elizabeth had not planned any of this exactly. She had supported what she could afford, reined in what seemed too expensive, and let her sea dogs roam when it served her diplomatic purposes. But the energy of the age, the confidence, the restlessness, the conviction that the world was there to be found and claimed, was in some measure a product of the stability and pride that her reign had created. England under Elizabeth knew itself. It believed in itself. And that belief was the platform from which an empire would eventually be launched. Chapter 13. The Woman Behind the Crown. You could study Elizabeth I as a purely political animal, as a series of decisions, policies, tactical manoeuvres, and come away with a coherent and impressive picture. But you'd be missing her. She had a temper like a summer storm, sudden, loud, and then usually gone. She threw shoes. She was known to reduce grown men to tears with the sharpness of her tongue, and then charm them back into devoted loyalty within the hour. She used anger deliberately, as a tool, a performance, but she also genuinely felt it, and sometimes the line between the political performance and the authentic emotion was invisible, even to those closest to her. She was afraid of being old. As she aged into her 60s, she became increasingly resistant to any acknowledgement of her physical decline. The heavy white makeup, ceruse, made from white lead, that she painted on her face was partly fashion and partly a mask, a way of maintaining the image of timeless authority against the evidence of time. She wore her wigs after her own hair thinned. She demanded that her portraits show her as she was in her prime. There is something both poignant and characteristically fierce about this resistance. The woman who had always understood herself as an image, refusing to let the image age. She was funny. This is not something that tends to make it into the history books, but the people around her noted it. She had a quick, dry wit. She made jokes in Latin. She once reduced a visiting Polish ambassador to horrified silence by responding to his diplomatically offensive speech with an impromptu Latin counter-speech of such demolishing precision that the court burst into startled applause. She had an excellent ear for music, and is thought to have composed pieces herself, though attribution is uncertain. She danced until she was well into her 60s, apparently still displaying the vigour and elegance that had impressed visitors when she was young. She read constantly. Her library was extensive. She continued to translate Latin and Greek texts into English throughout her reign, apparently for the pleasure of it, or perhaps as an exercise in the discipline of precision that she valued above almost anything else. She translated Boethius. She translated Cicero. She translated Seneca's Hercules Oetaeus in the last decade of her life, working on it during one of the lowest periods of her reign. She was, in every meaningful sense, an intellectual, not as a pose, not as a performance of feminine learning. She'd had quite enough of being praised for her accomplishments as if they were surprising for a woman. But because she genuinely loved ideas, loved language, loved the work of the mind, she never confided completely in anyone, not in Cecil, not in Dudley, not in the women who slept in her bedchamber for decades. She had learned too early and too painfully what happened when you gave someone all of yourself, what they could do with it, intentionally or otherwise. She kept something back always, whether this was wisdom or damage, probably both. She was never entirely knowable to the people around her, which meant she was never entirely vulnerable to them either. This is perhaps the most Elizabethan thing about her, the way she transformed her damage into her defence and her defence into her power. Chapter 14. The Long Goodbye. Final Years and Death. By 1602, Elizabeth was 68 years old. In an age when the average life expectancy was somewhere in the early 40s, though upper-class individuals often lived considerably longer if they avoided epidemic disease, this was genuinely remarkable. Her health had never been robust. She had suffered from smallpox in 1562 and very nearly died. The illness left her face marked, which was perhaps part of why the heavy face paint became standard. She had various fevers and ailments over the years. She hated being ill, hated showing weakness, and the court learned to pretend not to notice when she was unwell. The smallpox crisis of 1562 is worth pausing on, because it illuminates something important about the fragility underpinning the whole Elizabethan project. She was 29 years old, had been queen for 4 years, and had no named successor. When she fell desperately ill and for several days it seemed she might die, the council was in a state approaching panic. Who would rule? Mary Queen of Scots, her Catholic cousin, was the obvious claimant. The Protestant Reformation, the Elizabethan settlement, everything that had been built, it all hung on the life of one young woman with a fever. The vulnerability of the whole arrangement was laid bare. She recovered. She was shaken by how close it had been, and for a while afterward she showed more willingness to discuss the succession question. But old habits reasserted themselves quickly. She went back to managing the question rather than answering it. But the last 2 years of her reign were visibly hard. Essex's execution in 1601 had left a shadow. Several of her oldest, closest friends were dead. Cat Ashley, Blanche Parry, Robert Dudley, Burvley. The generation that had known her before she was a queen, who had helped her survive to become one, was almost entirely gone. The loneliness of outliving everyone who had known you before. You were the most powerful person in the room is something almost impossible to communicate. By the end, she was surrounded by people who had only ever known her as the queen. To them, she had always been the icon. The young woman who had sat on wet steps at the tower and refused to move, who had scratched defiance onto a window pane with a diamond, who who had trembled in Woodstock while waiting to hear if she would live or die. That person existed only in her own memory. There was no one left to share the memory with. She also had the succession problem, unresolved after 45 years. She had never named an heir. Her closest advisers, Robert Cecil, now running the government with quiet efficiency, had already made secret contact with James VI of Scotland, Mary's son, preparing the ground for a smooth transition. Elizabeth almost certainly knew or suspected and chose to look away. It was one of the few times in her reign that she allowed a problem to be solved without her participation. In the winter of 1602 to 1603, she became seriously ill. She refused to eat properly. She sat in one place for hours, sometimes on cushions on the floor. She refused to go to bed, apparently unable to bear the implication of weakness that lying down represented. She stared into space. Some who saw her thought she was thinking. Others thought she was simply too tired to do anything else. There is one account from those final weeks that has stayed in the historical record, resonating with strange intimacy. Robert Cecil knelt before her and told her gently that she must go to bed. She fixed him with a look that everyone in the room immediately understood and said, little man, must is not a word to be used to princes." She was barely able to stand. She had been sitting on cushions on the floor for hours, and she still would not be told what she must do. She was helped to her bed eventually, not by command, but by the simple fact that her body would no longer cooperate. Her godson, Sir John Harrington, who visited in late January, wrote a heartbroken account of finding her pacing a chamber alone, her sword by her side, stabbing at the floor. She told him she was not well. It was the most nakedly honest thing she had said publicly in a very long time. By early March, she was dying. She was taken to bed eventually, after her condition made standing impossible. The Archbishop of Canterbury prayed with her. Her council gathered around, asking her to name her successor. By various accounts, she finally made some gesture of assent when James of Scotland was mentioned, though whether this was a clear confirmation or simply an exhausted inability to disagree is historically disputed. On the 24th of March, 1603, in the early hours of the morning, Queen Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old. She had reigned for 44 years and 4 months. The room was quiet. Outside, riders were already mounted, ready to carry the news north to Edinburgh, where James waited. The transition had been managed before she had fully left. It was, in its way, the most Elizabethan ending possible. Power managed smoothly, the appearance of control maintained to the last, and the woman who had wielded that power slipping away quietly in the dark, alone, except for her attendants, while the world was already beginning to arrange itself for whoever came next. Chapter 15. The Legacy. What she left behind. What do you leave behind when you have been the centre of a world for 44 years? You leave behind, first of all, a kingdom transformed. Elizabeth inherited a country that was broke, religiously fractured, diplomatically isolated, and still stinging from the loss of Calais, England's last foothold in France. She left behind a country that had established its religious settlement, built its naval power, begun its overseas enterprise, and, perhaps most critically, established a cultural confidence in itself that would prove to be one of the most durable things she ever created. She left behind the Church of England as a functioning institution. However imperfect, however ideologically compromised, it held. It held through the pressures of both Puritans and Counter-Reformation Catholics. It is still holding today. She left behind an English literature. This is not a small thing. The poets, playwrights, and prose writers of the Elizabethan age didn't just produce great individual works. They established the English language as a vehicle capable of containing the full weight of human experience. Shakespeare alone transformed what English could do. The Elizabethan age was when English stopped being a provincial language and became a world one, and the cultural conditions that Elizabeth's reign created were part of that transformation. She left behind a country with an emerging sense of itself as a maritime and commercial power, the East India Company, the beginnings of Atlantic exploration, the established tradition of English sea power. These were seeds planted during her reign that grew over the following centuries into something enormous. She left behind, less tangibly, but no less really, a template for what a woman in power could be. This is complicated because Elizabeth herself was not a feminist in any modern sense. She used her femininity when it served her and denied it when it didn't. She expressed open contempt for women in power in general, and her reign did virtually nothing to expand the legal or social position of women in England. She was an exception, not a reformer. And yet, she was there. For 44 years, the most powerful person in England, one of the most powerful people in the world, was a woman. Her portrait hung on walls across the country. Her name defined an era. She had done it not by becoming a man, not by deferring to men, not by following the rules of a game built by and for men, but by playing a different game altogether, one with rules she wrote herself as she went. The myth of Elizabeth outlasted her almost immediately. Within years of her death, she had become the Golden Queen, the perfect monarch, the age she presided over a paradise of lost national greatness. This was unfair to the actual decades, which contained plenty of poverty, religious persecution, poor harvests, plague, and the grinding misery of an Irish war. The Golden Age was real in some respects and invented in others, but myths, when they're strong enough, have their own reality. The idea of Elizabeth, the red-haired woman in armour at Tilbury, the queen who said she had the heart and stomach of a king, the lonely sovereign who gave everything she had to a country she loved, became part of the English imagination in a way that was permanent. You can see it in every subsequent English queen, in the complicated mythology surrounding Elizabeth II, in the hundreds of films and novels and plays and television series that keep returning to her. She doesn't belong only to history. She belongs to the story a country tells about itself. There is something especially poignant about the way her legend was constructed, almost immediately after her death. James I, practical, Scottish, not interested in the Elizabethan mythology, moved quickly to dismantle some of the theatrical apparatus of his predecessor's reign. The cult of Gloriana had no place in a court that preferred a different style of governance, but the English people, and particularly the writers and artists and poets who had flourished under Elizabeth, found themselves looking back at the reign with a nostalgia that intensified with every year that passed. By the time Shakespeare was writing his history plays, and some scholars believe the portrait of the old king in King Lear contains elements drawn from observations of the ageing Elizabeth, she was already becoming something beyond biography. She was becoming myth. She had always been constructing herself as myth, of course, but now the construction had escaped her control entirely, which is perhaps the most appropriate thing that could have happened to someone who had spent her life trying to control everything. 500 years later, we are still arguing about her. Was she a feminist icon, or a woman who owed her position entirely to the male dynastic system that produced her? Was the Elizabethan settlement a work of political genius, or a compromise that satisfied nobody and solved nothing long-term? Was the execution of Mary a necessary act of state or an act of political cowardice, a decision she made and then tried to evade responsibility for? Was her refusal to marry evidence of political brilliance or psychological damage from a childhood spent watching the consequences of being a woman near power? The answers, as with almost everything about Elizabeth, are probably all of these things at once. She was a woman shaped by exceptional circumstances, who responded to those circumstances with exceptional intelligence and exceptional will. She was not perfect. No one who governed for 44 years could be, and some of the imperfections were costly, but she was extraordinary. And the specific nature of her extraordinariness, the way she took the most constrained position possible, a woman, illegitimate, in a world built entirely around the power of men, and turned it into the most powerful position in England, is something that resonates across 5 centuries in a way that pure political skill alone cannot explain. She survived everything, and in doing so, she changed what was possible. Conclusion: what she really was. So who was she, finally? After all of it, the plots and the portraits, the speeches and the silences, the lovers kept at arm's length and the enemies destroyed, the 44 years of performance and the private hours of grief and lute music. She was a woman who was told from the moment of her birth that she was not enough. Not the right sex, not the right religion, not legitimate, not safe, not trusted. She was told this by her father's neglect and her mother's execution, by the Acts of Parliament that stripped her title and the interrogators who tried to strip her composure, by every suitor who wanted to own her, and every counsellor who wanted to manage her, and every foreign power that saw her as a problem to be solved. And she refused, not loudly, not always, not in the ways we might imagine from the outside. She refused strategically, methodically, over a lifetime of extraordinary self-discipline. She took every disadvantage, her gender, her illegitimacy, her isolation, and turned it somehow into the architecture of her power. She made her vulnerability into a throne. She was not perfect. She could be vain, cruel, indecisive to the point of damage. She left Ireland a wound that still hadn't healed centuries later. She could be a terrible procrastinator and an exhausting employer. The people who loved her most were worn down by her, even as they remained devoted. Think for a moment about what William Cecil endured in 40 years of serving her. The man was one of the great administrators of the age, methodical, brilliant, completely dedicated, and yet he spent 4 decades never quite knowing when she would override him, never quite knowing when a decision they had agreed on would be reversed with no explanation, never quite knowing whether a policy she had approved on Tuesday would still be approved on Thursday. He wrote her letters that are monuments of patient diplomacy, trying to manage her without appearing to manage her, trying to advise without appearing to presume. He served her because he believed in her and believed in England, and also because there was, genuinely, nowhere more interesting to be. Robert Dudley loved her for 30 years and never had her. He was given everything except the one thing he wanted, which was to be publicly, permanently, undeniably hers. She gave him titles, access, influence, money. She called him her eyes. She may, in whatever way she allowed herself, have loved him, and she never married him. He died in September 1588, just weeks after the greatest triumph of her reign, and she folded the last letter he sent her and wrote on the outside, in her own hand, his last letter. She kept it until she died. It was found among her private papers. These details matter. They are the evidence of a person inside the performance, a person who felt things deeply but had decided, somewhere in the long years of surviving danger, that the feelings could only be allowed a very limited expression. A person who was, in ways she could never entirely control, alone. But also, and this needs to be said too, a person who had chosen this, deliberately, with full understanding of the cost. She had looked at what marriage meant for queens, what dependence on men had meant for every woman she had ever observed near power, and she had made a different calculation. Whether you call it wisdom or damage or some alloy of both, it was her calculation. She made it. She lived it. She built her life around it for 44 years. And what she built in the space those 44 years created was extraordinary. Not just the ships and the plays and the church and the trade routes, but something harder to name, a period of English history that people look back at and feel as a kind of brightness, an age of possibility, a time when the world seemed to be opening outward and England was bold enough to go toward it. That feeling, that expansive, restless, creative energy is what we mean when we say Elizabethan. And it was her. She was not perfect, but she was also, and this deserves to be said plainly, one of the most remarkable human beings who ever lived. Intelligent in a way that was genuinely exceptional, brave in a way that was tested repeatedly under conditions that would have broken most people, disciplined in a way that was, when you consider what she had survived to get where she was, almost supernatural. She ruled England for 44 years. She gave it stability in a period when stability was a kind of miracle. She built the cultural conditions in which Shakespeare could write, Drake could sail, and an empire could begin to imagine itself. She survived everything, and on the night of March 24th, 1603, when she finally lay down and let herself be still, she had outlasted almost everyone who had ever tried to stop her. That's not nothing. That's, in fact, almost everything. When James I rode south from Edinburgh to claim his new kingdom, he passed through the country Elizabeth had shaped. He passed through towns where her portraits hung, where people had grown up knowing no other monarch. He inherited a country that, whatever its problems and its tensions and its unsolved questions, had a sense of itself, a national story, a national pride, a national language and literature that had been made magnificent in the previous 50 years. He didn't always appreciate what he was inheriting. He found the English people and their parliament rather more assertive than he was accustomed to, and said so. But what he had inherited was nonetheless extraordinary. And in the years and decades and centuries that followed, as England became Britain, and Britain became an empire, and the empire spread across the world, carrying the English language with it, the shadow of Elizabeth stretched forward through all of it. The culture she had patronized, the sea power she had encouraged, the religious settlement she had imposed, the commercial spirit she had tolerated, all of it grew into something that remade the world. It would be too simple to say she caused all of this. History is never that tidy, but she was there at the beginning of it, holding everything together long enough for the seeds to take root. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Stories like this one remind us that history is never just dates and battles. It's the intimate texture of a life lived under impossible pressure, and the extraordinary things people are capable of when they refuse to be broken. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, please like the video, leave a comment about who you'd like to hear about next, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one.